we will have to focus on the influence of trimming and shoeing on the swing phase. And unfortunately, that's a topic where we don't have a lot of research. So I will present you some studies, but the studies I present you, they are almost everything available in the research at the moment. So that's why we also did our own studies. And yeah, I will also present you the first results from our study we did in 2020 with black. And how I said, we all use different types of shoeing. So a lot of times we play a little bit with weight. So we play with unilateral weight distribution. If you have horses striking the contralateral limb, or in gaited horses, we try to influence the gait quality by adding more weight at the hoofs or whatever. So I will show you some different modifications and also some manipulations at the hoofs, and we will hopefully have a good overview in the end of the webinar, and it might help you in your daily practice. I will start with a short case report, and it's a dressage horse. It's quite a good dressage horse, and as you can see, it has uneven feet with angle difference of 9 degrees. And you see the left foot is flatter than the right foot. And if you see the flight arc pattern, so if you see the images below, so you can see in walk and trot the shape and the height of the flight arc. Yellow is left and red is the right hoof. And you see, although we have a quite high difference between the 2 feet, we have a quite symmetrical flight arc. Yeah, so the shape and also the height of the flight arc, in particular in trot, is symmetrical. And this is a little bit against all the research and all the assumptions we have in the books, because usually it was stated that steeper hoofs have a later peak than the flatter hoofs in the flight arc, for example. And as you can see, the symmetry between left and right is quite nice, and it's a good horse, so it's usually a good criteria if you have symmetry in the gait of dressage horses. And although we have a structural asymmetry, we have a quite good functional symmetry. Yeah. So, and this was the situation before shoeing, and we compare this situation after the first shoeing. We did a slight angle correction, so I tried to adapt the angles of the hoofs, and we have a 2 degrees deeper orientation of the flatter foot. So we increased the symmetry a little bit, but and if you can have a look at the flight arc height, we see that the height of the flight arc now is asymmetrical. So suddenly we don't have a symmetrical gait pattern anymore, although we tried to achieve a symmetrical hoof. The swing duration stays unaffected. So this is a thing we will see quite often in the webinar. So the duration of swing phase, so from breaking over to first initial contact of the next step, this duration is very, very little affected by our shoeing. So this timing is a parameter which might be belonging to the horse. And we saw the last time that the proximal locomotor system, the muscles and the shoulder girdle, for example, or the pelvic muscles, they are actually influencing and maintaining the motion of the limb in swing phase. So this is why we maybe don't influence the duration of swing phase, but I will show you we can definitely have an effect on the shape of the flight arc and the motion of the limb to the medial and lateral side. But if we come back to the source, we did an angle correction of the hoofs, but we increased the functional asymmetry during swing phase. And after 4 weeks, we see that the horse is slightly, slowly adapting and coming back to its old pattern. Yeah. So, but now we see we have a little problem. We actually wanted to have symmetry in the hoofs, but we have asymmetry in the flight arc. And yeah, maybe we can explain, or maybe we can have a solution in the end of the webinar. Because if you have a look here in this slide, it's still the same horse. It's also before the first shoeing, after the first shoeing, and after 4 weeks. We see the sideway motion of the horse in walk and trot. And as you can see, it's tending to winging in with both limbs, and it's not changing. So the pattern itself, so the individual motion pattern of the horse stays the same, independent from our treatment. So this is the first message I would like to give you. We have an effect, don't worry. So we will have an effect with our shoeing, but we have to respect that we have an individual determination or individual influence by neuromuscular pathways, let's say it like this. Yeah, so we have a training effect, we have the muscles working, the whole locomotor system is adapted and has learned a specific motion pattern. So we shouldn't overestimate our effect. We have effects, but they are specific, and we have to think about our effects and if we really want to have them. Yeah, so and usually if we want to influence the swing phase by shoeing, we try to change the position of breakover, for example, at the toe, because we learned that a lot of forces break over the lateral or medial toe. The majority of forces break over the lateral toe, but of course, in our ideal thinking, we want to have a straight breakover over the central toe. And if we force it, so if we create, for example, a specific rolled toe and we force these forces to break over the central toe, we create rotational forces before and after breakover. Because actually we have slight asymmetries in the articular joint surfaces, and these asymmetries in the joints, of course, cause that we have a unilateral breakover. And if we now force a straight breakover, we have rotational forces and we increase the sideway motion during swing phase. At least this is a very logical assumption. We haven't proved it yet, but I think we will in one time. But don't forget that sometimes the gait pattern is belonging to the specific conformation of the locomotor system. What is very common is that we try to change the weight, and usually we use, for example, aluminum shoes to reduce weight, and we would like to have an effect in the swing phase, but also, for example, in orthopedic cases. Then we can also change the unilateral weight distribution. As I told you, this nice shoe was, for example, created by Guy Kash. So thanks, Guy, for this nice shoe. And how I said the last time, we learned that the muscles of the shoulder and the pelvis and also a little bit of the back influence the motion of the limb in swing phase. So we definitely know that training and treatments, for example, physiotherapy, influence the function of the proximal locomotor system and thereby also of the swing phase. So now we have a question mark. So now we would like to find an answer if all these parameters except the training and treatment definitely have the effects we expect. Yeah, and the aim of trimming and shoeing is sometimes a little bit different between shoeing for sport horses and orthopedic issues. So if we focus on the athletic horses, so we would like to have an improvement of the motion quality by our shoeing or trimming. And this is often described by the rider or by the trainer with freedom of the shoulder or high action of the forehand. They would like to see maximum propulsion of the hinds, long strides. It should look light and easy. And they, of course, prefer symmetry. If we have an orthopedic patient, there we have a little bit different aim sometimes. It's not that the athletic aims and the orthopedic aims match each other in all cases. So usually if we have an orthopedic patient, we would like to support and maintain the physiological function of the locomotor system. But this we will look at in the next part of the presentation. First, we focus on the sport horses. And as I said, these criteria or these evaluation criteria, they are very unspecific. Yeah? So they don't have a very specific meaning. And yeah, we actually would like to see an improvement of the motion quality after the shoeing for different disciplines. For example, in dressage or trotting or gaited horses, we would like to see an impressive flight arc, long strides. We would like to have a stable motion pattern and, how is that, bilateral symmetry. And there was a good work of a Swedish research group, and they examined 8 stallions, and these 8 stallions were divided into 4 and 4, and the horses were judged for gait quality, and they examined the parameters belonging to horses judged as good, and the horse is judged with a poor gait quality. And the stallions judged or evaluated with a good gait quality, they showed long strides. So this means a longer stride duration. And then we have a lower stride frequency. So we have really long and nice strides. Then they showed a longer retraction and more flexion in the elbow and the carpal joint during swing phase. And they have an increase, they saw an increased stance duration in the hinds, what means that we have more propulsion because the horses have more time and they can better store forces and create tension to enable a really good propulsion of the body. And these horses also showed a good parallelity and symmetry between landing and propulsion of the diagonal limb pairs in trot. And this is an indicator for a good balance and a good ability of weight bearing. So this is actually evidence for evaluation of horses and their gait. Yeah, and this is actually what we would like to achieve or at least maintain with our shoeing. And this is all this is connected to the swing phase. So if we just repeat how swing phase works, actually we have a very, very early, so shortly before swing phase, we have the release of stored energy in the long tendons, in the whole locomotor system, in the muscles of the shoulder girdle, for example, and they initiate locomotion of the limb to swing phase. So then swing phase starts, and actually it's just a passive pendulum of the distal limb around the shoulder. And so in the first, we have very little mass in the distal limb. This is done by evolution. So we don't have muscles in the distal limb to reduce weight. And that's why the distal limb passively commute around the shoulder. And then actually the swing phase itself is maintained by the muscles of the shoulder girdle, and the distal limb, the hoof, for example, follows passively. Yeah, so this is actually what we try to influence. So by changing the mass of the hoof, we change inertia, and that's changing the pendulum properties. Yeah. And we have two phases of swing phase. So in the first phase, we have high flexion in the coffin joints, in the digital joints, in the fetlock, the carpus, and the shoulder. And then the limb swings forward, and we need activity of the shoulder and the chest muscles. And then the second part of the swing phase, all joints are extended, and we have the elongation of the limb until landing. And a good quality gait or a good evaluated gait is usually showing a high range of motion in the joints. Usually we see more flexion in the joints, and this is just done by, for example, if we shoe and we create more mass in the end of the distal limb. And there was also a good study from a Dutch research group, and they shot horses, and they just concluded from their study, if you shoe horses, you increase the weight of the hoof. So we change the pendulum properties of the limb. And they said this is actually improves the trot quality, because the parameters we stated in the beginning on the slide with the Swedish research group, we definitely can change the gait parameters in that way that horses are judged better if they were shot. Yeah, so we have now an increased weight, yeah, by horseshoes. So this increases the inertia at the distal limb. So we change the pendulum properties of the limb, and these horses are usually judged as good if they are trotted in a competition, for example. And to the right, you see one horse barefoot and shot. And before shoeing, you see we have a height of the flight arc of 15 centimeters, and after shoeing, the height of the flight arc increases to 21 centimeters. This is a big change for such a horse. And you also see that the shape of the flight arc is different. After shoeing, we have a higher and longer flight arc. Yeah, so not longer flight arc, but the flight arc has a longer height and is more expressive than if the horse was barefoot. But we have also another example before and after shoeing, and there you see the opposite. Yeah, so it's not that we can concluded for all horses, we have individual differences. So some of the horses react in a very intended way, and other horses just compensate the weight of the shoe. And this might be also related to the fact if horses are shod for the first time, for example, or if they are regularly shod, or if they have a stable training and a stable locomotor system, or if they are a little bit unstable and young horses just beginning with training. So different influences affect the reaction on shoeing. Yeah. And the study also concluded some key results. And in their study, they examined horses shod for the first time. So it's not clear how horses react if they were shod regularly, but horses shod for the first time showed an increase of the flight arc height about 70% after shoeing. Yeah. They also increase the stride length and duration. We see more flexion in the carpal joint and the digital joints, and we have a decrease of protraction in the swing phase. So all these parameters are, how I said, are judged as good in sport horses. So in this case, shoeing has a, let's say, good effect on the function of the limb. But if we have more flexion and, for example, in the fetlock, in the coffin joint and in the carpal joint, we have more range of motion, and this is of course a little bit more load on the joints as well. And in addition, if we have more mass at the hoofs, of course, the muscles need to have more effort to stabilize the limb swing phase. Yeah, so of course, for sport perspective, the parameters or the change in the parameters is good, but for the muscular system and for the locomotor system, it means more effort. Yeah. Another group examined the activity of the muscles before and after shoeing, and they increased the weight with a normal steel shoe. And they saw that in the first part of the swing phase, as I tried to illustrate in the right image, we have more activity in the elbow flexor muscles, so for example, the triceps, and we have increased strain in all the muscles which are responsible to stabilize the limb in the distal part and the extensor side. Yeah, and in the second part of the swing phase, we have a little bit the opposite. There we have more activity in the elbow extensor muscles, like the biceps, and we have increased strain in the flexors of the distal limb to, as the opposing player to the extension of the limb. Yeah, so you can see after shoeing, because of the increased weight at the distal limb, we have more tension and more force or more activity in the stated muscles. That shows that we have also more effort in these regions. And for example, the triceps is quite often a muscle which is suffering on fatigue or is has a hypertension. So we have some problems in these muscles. So you can imagine that just some horses don't benefit from increased weight at the hoofs. Yeah, so normal good trained horse can compensate it, and we have this nice gait pattern. But some horses which are poorly trained or which has some problems might not benefit from increased weight at the hoof. Yeah. Another group also examined the difference between barefoot and shod horses. They have the same results. Yeah, so barefoot hoofs have usually a higher stride frequency, less stride length and duration, and less range of motion. But this can also be a benefit, for example, if you have orthopedic cases, for example, horses suffering from arthrosis. Yeah, in a sports horse, it's not really nice to have this type of gait, but in orthopedic cases, this might be a quite good solution. And they also said there's no difference between the application of different shoes. So they examined the use of ECPA shoes and NBS shoes, and they said there's not really a difference in the flight, in the swing phase, and the gait quality dependent on different shoes. Yeah. In the hinds, there's very little research. There's actually just one study from Clayton, and they added 700 grams as additional weights in the hinds. Just to increase the height of the flight arc with the aim to increase the activity of the hip and tarsal muscles. So they increase the flexion of the joints in the hind. They horses had to work more with the hind muscles, and they said it's a quite good training. Yeah. So, but again, we have compensatory strain in muscles stabilizing the distal limb. So it's a pro and contra. So you have a quite good training effect maybe, but you have also more load on the muscles stabilizing the limb. So, and to bring a little bit more light into the question marks, we did an own study, as I showed you in the webinar for the breakover, I guess. And we examined 10 sound horses of different breeds in one stable, and we examined the horses on firm and penetrable ground. And with focus on this webinar, we did it, of course, on penetrable and firm ground. We will focus on the firm ground because this is easier at the moment, and we examined these modifications. In total, we had 12 different situations and conditions. But for this webinar, it's important to know that we examined the horses barefoot before and after trimming. And then we taped some side wedges. So on the medial side of the hoof, side wedge of 5 degrees. Then we added lateral weight of 120 gram at the lateral side of the hoofs. Then we added bilateral weights of 240 gram. And then we shod the horses with steel and aluminum shoes. Here's just an overview of the parameters, and if I show you the results, usually barefoot after trimming is our reference, and then we can see the difference, for example, to a 5 degree side wedge at the medial side or the lateral weight or whatever. Yeah, so this is just that you know what we examined and how it looked. And of course, all data were speed corrected. We know from the last webinar that swing phase duration is not really a parameter which is really speed dependent. So we saw already in the last webinar that between walk and trot, the values of the swing duration does not change. And nevertheless, because we corrected all data for speed, the data and comparison I show you are speed corrected. And this is also included into the black system already. So in our study, we can see before and after shoeing. So blue is before shoeing, orange is shot, so after shoeing. And we see highlighted or a little bit more colorful the significant differences. So you can see in trot, we have an increase of flight arc height after shoeing and also an increase in sideway motion. So this means what this is the same what the previous studies already saw. So the height of the flight arc increases, but how I said, we could show that the sideway motion also increases. That might be because of the additional weight on the limb. And this is also one result where I think it might be not helpful for horses suffering on problems in the proximal locomotor system, or on arthrosis, for example. In addition, we have a longer swing duration and we also have a longer step length. So all the parameters fit the results I showed you before. And there are some possibilities to increase weight more. You can use heavier shoes, or sometimes we use pads or packing for orthopedic cases, or we have the gated horses, the Icelandic horses, where some times ago we had the shoeing with long hoofs filled with packing material and a little bit more heavier shoes in the front. Or sometimes we just add some welding parts for orthopedic problems and we add weight. So all the images I show you in the slide add some weight at the hoofs. And this additional weight was also examined by another Dutch research group. So if you increase the weight more than a normal shoeing, then not just the height of the hoof, also the height of the carpus in the fetlock increases. So the whole limb is a little bit higher in the flight arc. And this means, again, more strain and more load on the muscles. And they said it's also important where you have the weight distribution. So for example, toe weights like the wide toe shoe increase flexion of the limb and support an active gait pattern, while Ekbar shoes with adding palmar weight cause a less active gait pattern. We couldn't prove it right now, but in their study, at least, this was a result. Yeah. And we have a closer look on the gated horses, because I think in this discipline, it's one of the most common shoeing aims that you increase weight in the hooves to improve the gait quality. And if you increase the shoeing, or if horses are really shod with heavier shoes in the front, a Swiss research group showed that you have a lower stride frequency, increased stride length, higher flight arc, and more velocity of the hoofs in the swing phase, but also higher braking forces during landing. Yeah, of course, if the limb is higher, if the limb is faster, you have more forces, more peak forces during landing. And this is also a critical thing, in particular if you see the hard and quite fast surfaces these horses are walking on. Yeah, and here again, the same research group showed, this was an image from, not from this group, but as you could see it sometimes in praxis, long Icelandic hoofs filled with packing material before this kind of shoeing and after shoeing with a normal shoe. And they said you can improve, of course, the clearness of the gait, and you can increase the stride duration if you have these long and heavy hoofs, but you also increase breakover duration, and you have a higher variability between strides. So you don't have a good consistency. And this shows that these horses are actually not able to stabilize their limbs. Yeah, so if all strides differ, or if you have a high variability between strides, this is an indicator that they are just need to have a lot of effort to stabilize the limb during the high and fast gaits. In our study, we just added 240 gram, and we just saw an increase of the flight arc. So this is not really something new. This is actually something we expected. Yeah, but I would like to show you two examples. We have one horse, you see in the left the situation barefoot, and then the right, the same horse with the 240 gram weights. And you see nothing changes actually. Yeah, so the horse compensates the effect of the weight completely. But another horse, horse 2, again on the left side barefoot, on the right side with 240 gram, you see this horse reacts with a high increase of the flight arc, and also the shape of the flight arc changes. So we have the peak a little bit earlier and longer. Yeah, and these horses are completely different. So one horse 1, was a riding school horse and quite stable and quite good training status, and the gait pattern was really, fixed. So there was nothing to influence this horse a lot. But horse 2 was a little bit younger and not as stable and not as trained as horse 1, and you see a direct effect of the weights. Yeah, so maybe this is a criteria where you can judge if a change of weight might affect the flight arc, for example. So the training status, the age of the horse, and if it was shot before or not, might influence the reaction on weight. Yeah. Then we had one application of lateral weights. So a lot of horses tend to wing in, and then sometimes we have the problems that they strike the contralateral limb, and we have injuries of this contralateral limb. So then you try to create a shoeing where you have a lighter inner branch and a little bit heavier lateral branch. This was something we tried to create with adding lateral weights, and you see the sideway motion indeed decreases. Yeah, so this this manipulation seemed to affect the sideway motion of the hoof during swing phase. And I brought you again this example. Not all horses show it again. Yeah, so in general, it seemed to have an effect. But again, there are some horses like this one, the left barefoot and the right with lateral weights at the lateral wall. And this horse is compensating the change of 120 gram weight at the lateral wall. So if you have this horse and you create its striking contralateral limb and you would like to make a shoeing to affect it, it's hardly possible to change it. It might be that the proximal locomotor system is already too stiff, or it's adapted to all the gait pattern. and then you can't really change something. Then it's advisable, before you create a fancy shoe, maybe to add some weight at the lateral wall and have a look if you can really achieve something or not. But how I said, in general, horses can react on this type of changes with less swinging in. Yeah, but how I said, in stable horses, in good trained horses, this might be not achievable. So, and this is already something more or less orthopedic. So we have a look on orthopedic cases. And there, how I said, we would like to strengthen the muscles to optimize bearing function, also to have an optimal function during swing phase. And we would like to relieve the passive locomotor system, for example, if you have a good working shock absorption of the long tendons and the muscles. And we don't want to have too high braking forces during landing. Yeah, in particular, in horses suffering from bone diseases as arthrosis or podotrachlosis, yeah, we don't want to have high peak forces during landing. And I brought you again a second case. This is a show jumper. It's actually still in training. It's also competing, but from time to time it's lame, like 1 or 2 out of 5. So not a high lameness, but it's a problem if you have a vet check and the horse is not going to pass the vet check. And after diagnosis, we saw that the horse has podotrachlosis, and we changed the shoeing from a steel shoe to aluminum shoe. And you see the steel shoe in walk and the aluminum shoe in walk, and you see we have a lower flight height of the flight arc after shoeing with aluminum, and the same was in trot. So the flight arc decreased after shoeing with aluminum shoes, and also the sideway motion decreased, at least in walk, after shoeing with aluminum shoes, and we had less variability between strides. So the horse was it was a little bit easier for the horse to stabilize the limb, and it had less sideway motion. So this was the effect with the aluminum shoe, and with aluminum shoes, this horse at least is walking quite fine. It's still in training, and usually it passes the vet check and it walks much better and competes or perform much better with aluminum shoes. Yeah, and this was also part of some research. So there's one group examining the effect of aluminum shoes, and they saw less flexion in the carpus, a lower height of the flight arcs, and less range of motion in the elbow and the fetlock joint. Sorry, no effect on the elbow and fetlock joint, but less flexion in the carpus. And I think if you would examine some more horses, so they didn't have a lot of horses, and if you would have a little bit more specific examination technique, you would also see less flexion in the coffin joint and the fetlock joint maybe. But let's say we have less range of motion in the carpus, combined with a lower height of the flight arc and a little bit reduced swing duration. So this means we have less forces affecting the hoof during landing. Yeah. For example, in this horse, this was also a case of mine. With steel shoes, we had 16 centimeters, with aluminum shoes 13 centimeters height of the flight arc, and again the sideway motion was reduced, and this was a horse suffering from arthrosis, and again with aluminum shoes it was walking much better. Yeah, so the background, I think the therapeutic background of the use of aluminum shoes in horses suffering from bone diseases is that you have less height and less sideway motion, so less range of motion in the joints during swing phase. And if you don't have such a high flight arc, you have less forces during initial contact. But again, yeah, we have another case. This horse is suffering since more than 10 years from a bone cystis in the coffin joint. And it was initially shot when I saw her the first time with a very heavy and not really nice placed artificial shoe, like a Duplo shoe. And we shot her again with aluminum shoe with pad and packing, and there was absolutely no difference. So although we have more comfort, although it's a little bit lighter, and although we have a good breakover and we changed a lot on the shoeing, this horse was not reacting at all. And this is because of pain. I told you the last time that chronic pain influences also the motion pattern of the horse, because it's more, it's a fact that has chronic pain has more effect on the locomotion than our shoeing. Yeah. If you would like to see the pain physiology, I think you have to just to watch the last webinar. Yeah. And then another thing sometimes used to, or at least there's an assumption, if you change the hoof angulation, you also can affect the height of the and the swing pattern during swing phase. Sorry, you can you can, for example, have a flatter hoof or a steeper hoof angulation. And horses with a flatter hoof angulation, they are said to have a longer stride length and an early peak in the flight arc, while steeper hoofs has a shorter step length and a later peak in the high flight arc. Yeah, this was not really proved until now, so we couldn't prove it in our study, and it's not really proved in literature. I think this is an assumption from the past, with the background that steep hoofs have a little bit faster breakover, and then it's not as high, or they don't have such a ground resistance to create a high peak in the flight arc very early. But as we saw the last time in a breakover webinar, hoof angulation is not correlated with breakover duration, and also not with the shape of the flight arc in swing phase. Yeah, and I brought again an example of a horse suffering from a very acute tendon lesion. It was not that lame, but we changed the shoeing, and of course we used a 5-degree heel wedge, so we had a 5-degree elevation of the heels. And although we had an angle difference of 5 degrees before and after shoeing, there was no change in the shape or the height of the flight arc. So this was absolutely compensated. I think angle changes does not really affect the flight arc in the swing phase that much. Yeah, I think it's more important how the proximal locomotor system works. But another thing are side wedges. So some horses tend to, or a lot of horses tend to land at the lateral side. So we added a side wedge on the medial side just to change landing actually, but it's also a question if we have an effect in the swing phase. We can see that the height of the flight arc is increased. Yeah, okay. And then we have a very confusing result in walk. We have an increase of sideway motion. In trot, we have a decrease of sideway motion. So I think we see an effect, but it's absolutely not clear what really happens. So manipulations in the mediolateral plane are always very difficult, and they're very difficult to understand because we have so different and individual pattern in the gait and also in the reactions. But I brought you an example just to show you that we have an effect. You see again on the left the horse barefoot, on the right you see the horse with a medial side wedge. And you can see barefoot, this horse tends to wing out with the limbs. And by using the side wedge, the medial side wedge, the horse start to wing in. And this is a very interesting result because usually it's very difficult to modify the individual gait pattern, as we saw several times now. But for example, in this case, we have quite clear reaction on a side wedge. So manipulations in the mediolateral plane seem to influence also the motion of the limb in swing phase. Yeah. This doesn't mean that you have to use side wedges, but you can also achieve it, for example, by unilateral trimming. Yeah. So if you would like to have a correction in horses tending to wing in or to wing out, and you anyway have to correct the limb in the mediolateral plane by trimming the one side of the hoof, you can have a positive effect on the swing phase as well. So if we conclude our webinar, because I know it was a little bit confusing, maybe it's not easy to explain and there were a lot of research, but if you conclude our results, we know that if we shoe with normal steel shoes, we increase the weight of the limb. So we increase height of the flight arc and also of the swing duration, and we have more range of motion, more flexion in the joints of the forelimb. If we have an application of lateral weights, we can reduce the sideway motion of the limb during swing phase. So this might be useful in horses tending to strike. And we know now that a change of hoof angulation in the mediolateral plane has not a significant effect on sideway motion, but we can have in single cases effect or an improvement of the motion of the limb during swing phase. And shoeing off with aluminum shoes reduce weight, and we have a decrease of flight arc and reduced swing duration, what might be helpful because of less braking forces during initial contact. Yeah, that was the webinar to the influence of shoeing and trimming on the swing phase. I hope it was something useful for your practice in there. And if you would like to see case reports, the next time a colleague of mine will show you a case report about influencing the swing phase by shoeing. And I think there's still time for some questions. Right, Mehmet?
Okay, thank you. First of all, Jenny, it was a great clinic again, great webinar. Yeah, if you have questions right now, you can just unmute your microphone and ask the questions directly to Jenny. If you don't want to, you can also send us an email. But I think Johannes is going to ask something. No, he just turned on his microphone, but not. Yeah, like I said, you can also send us an email, or you can just wait for the next webinar, so you will see Jenny again, then you can ask your questions there as well.
Always.
And
you can also write questions if you want.
Yeah, and of course, we understand the time is a little bit difficult for especially for the farriers from United States and Australia, and as well England. They are 1 hour before us. So yeah, it's working time coming home, but don't worry. All webinars we broadcast live. We are also putting it on our YouTube channel from Werkman. You can have a look at there also for the other webinars as well. But I think within 2 to 3 days, I'll be also putting this webinar on our Facebook page and in Instagram, so that you can just look at it one more time if you would like to. And like I said, these webinars are now about the swing phase of the hoof. The webinars before, they were over breakover, and the next series will be over landing. So if you could follow the series, you would really get a lot of information about all 3: breakover, swing, and the landing phases of the hoof. And if there are no questions, I thank to everyone for